Welcome back, Fort Collins, to the Rio Bike Nights, the third installment of the guest speaker series. The last two events we've had here at the Rio, last two Wednesdays, have been phenomenal. The first event we had Brad Tucker, a cycling lawyer with Colorado Bike Law. We had the pleasure to have Dan Burden present last week. And today we have Dom Nazi. So Dom Nazi, come on up. Let's give him a big round of applause.
Thank you, DK. Thank you for having me here tonight. I want to start by mentioning that what could be worse than making a public presentation about public safety and having a crash, having a visible injury, where I smashed my head today whitewater kayak in the Poudre River on a rock. What could be possibly worse timing than that? You know, my credibility, of course, is out the window for safety now, because all of you are thinking, well, this guy doesn't know anything about safety. He can't even keep himself safe. Of course, I can give you a story, too, about how I was involved in a deadly knife fight with the forces of evil. But I like to be honest and be a truth teller. By way of introduction for myself, I have been a regular recreational and commuter bicyclist now for 35 years. In the early 80s, I started a graduate degree in city planning at Florida State University in Tallahassee. My mentor happened to be Dan Burden, who you had as a speaker last week, and so we go back 26 years. My master's thesis topic was bicycle transportation, and I was a senior planner for the city of Gainesville, Florida for 20 years. Just recently moved to Boulder. Was a city planner in Boulder actually in the mid-90s for 18 months. So I have some awareness of the wonderful things going on here in Colorado and in Boulder, and I'm very happy to be here. Just moved here in December. So I want to start by emphasizing that controlling size is crucial for quality of life, for safety, for especially safety for bicyclists and pedestrians, and for convenience for those forms of travel. Bicyclists and pedestrians must have proximity between point A and point B, home and work, or home and school, or wherever you do on a regular basis. There must be proximity. Okay, and also, you know, and there are ways that you provide proximity by having, in your town center at least, you have smaller setbacks for buildings, you have smaller streets for safety, and so controlling size is very important, in large part because cars consume so much space that we have this very strong, powerful urge to build really big, gigantic spaces in our communities. And so controlling size is crucial for achieving a great many objectives that we often have. Big roads are really incompatible with the human habitat. Okay, humans and big roads tend to be really not good partners. They don't work well together. There tend to be a lot of problems with that. Of course, big roads tend to result from having a lot of car dependency in your community. One of your problems too is that you have this vicious cycle. As you try to avoid congestion by widening roads, you get into a vicious cycle where the widening of roads largely, or in important ways, contributes to a declining quality of life. People are seeing the quality of the human habitat go down, and so they tend to incrementally leave your town centers, and therefore there is even more political pressure to widen the roads even further to accommodate more and more people living in remote locations. So it's a vicious cycle. As I was saying earlier, high speeds are a real problem. With big roads, almost inevitably you get higher and higher speeds. A huge, enormous problem for bicyclists is what's called a speed differential. If you want to maximize safety for bicyclists, you minimize that difference in speed between cars and bicycles. Okay? When you do that, bicyclists feel much more comfortable and safe, understandably so. So speed reductions, especially in your town center and places where you expect to see large numbers of bicyclists, is essential for conduciveness for bicycling. Mixed and compact uses, mixed and compact land uses, in some cases appropriate higher density residential development in locations that are appropriate are essential for promoting transportation choices, obviously. If you have mixed uses, you're mixing offices and residential, you're mixing jobs and housing, mixing retail and housing, having high residential densities in your town centers, you have a much better chance of having transportation choices where people actually can choose to bicycle, to walk, to use transit. Without compact mixed-use development, it's very, very difficult for you to see any kinds of transportation choices. A great problem we have, an unintended consequence we have in our communities is that many of our communities are seeing this incremental growth in the size of our fire trucks. Fire trucks in most cities around the country, and Dan Burton possibly mentioned this last week, he often mentions this problem. We have this incremental growth in the size of fire trucks, which is actually starting to drive the size of new road construction. Road design is actually being driven not by community objectives so much, but by the need to accommodate large fire trucks. And I could talk about that a little bit later. Clearly, based on what I'm just saying, we really need to move towards smaller roads. We need to shrink the size of vehicles, like fire trucks and other service vehicles, to really see ourselves move in the direction of having smaller roads and more compactness and more quality of life for the human habitat. You know, in some places, often in Europe, you actually see human-scaled fire trucks. It's not really essential or necessary for us to have enormous gargantuan fire trucks. You can sometimes have human-scaled fire trucks based on the leadership of your elected officials saying, we don't want our fire trucks, our fire service to drive our road design. We're going to make a conscious decision to only buy smaller fire trucks, especially in our town centers where we really need compactness. We really need proximity. Over the past several decades, we have seen our traffic engineers engage in what a paradigm known as the forgiving road paradigm, the forgiving road design. Forgiving roads are designed to enable higher speed, more reckless driving, more inattentive driving. The thought by the engineers over the past several decades that we can minimize crashes by eliminating things that high-speed, reckless, inattentive drivers might crash into. So we want to see a removal oftentimes of street trees, moving buildings back, increasing the size of turning radii at intersections, moving street furniture away. On-street parking especially is a big concern for forgiving roads. If we can move all these things the way that people can crash into, we can have, apparently, safer roads because there's less thing to crash into. Well, of course, any social scientist or someone who understands human behavior knows what the result is of designing forgiving roads. We, of course, get what? Higher speeds. People are enabled to drive higher speeds. They drive higher speeds. They drive more inattentively. They drive more recklessly because they are forgiven for doing so. Okay? Forgiving roads enable this growth in really undesirable, unsafe travel behavior, and therefore people do more and more of it. In fact, you can say, and I don't know if we've seen studies of this, but you can say that what's happened with forgiving road design over the past several decades is that we're actually seeing a decline in American driving skills because they need less skills to drive safely in America, and so they can get away with being lazy in how they drive and actually being rather unsafe in how they drive. Anyone here know what 80% of all crashes are due to? Anyone? That's actually pretty close to the right answer. The correct 80% of all crashes are due to inattentive driving. 80% of all crashes. And of course, forgiving streets for the past several decades has actually increased the chances of people driving inattentively. Driving with a cell phone, driving with a lipstick going on, driving while eating. These things are enabled by the forgiving road system. We have inattentiveness epidemic. Okay? And what's happening? We're seeing a huge number of crashes as a result directly of how we design our roads. A man by the name of Peter Swift, a traffic engineer from Longmont, Colorado, close by here. He did a very important study a fairly recent time back where he looked at street crashes and the cause of those street crashes or correlations, and he found that there's a strong correlation between the width of roads and crashes. There's a positive correlation. That is, the wider your roads get, the more crashes you have. A lot of times wide roads or wider roads are caused by the fact that your fire department will request the wider roads for faster response times for the fire trucks. The firemen say, understandably, that you reduce response time, you save lives in fires. Okay? Now, one of the unintended consequences here, and this is what Swift found in the study, is that you tend to have actually a reduction in overall life safety. There are more crashes, there are more injuries and deaths in a community overall when you have wider roads, even if your response time by your fire truck is allowing you to save more and more lives in fires, because the number of injuries and deaths from fires is much lower than the number of injuries and deaths from car crashes. And in the Swift studies, finding a lot of car crashes caused by wider roads. So life safety is a better focus, a bigger umbrella for the overall community objectives of minimizing injuries and deaths. Fire safety tends to be a more narrow focus for safety. So we have to be careful and find a good trade-off between those two objectives, because just focusing, as we often do, on fire safety will result in unintended consequences. Hans Monderman, one of my heroes, makes a very important point in this topic. We really need to avoid the forgiving street paradigm that says let's design to assume that drivers are morons. Okay, when we design for morons, we tend to get moron behavior. Okay, we get more dangerous behavior. We get this inattentiveness. Okay, forgiving highways inevitably result in these inattentive behaviors. Forgiving roads. Okay, really unpleasant human habitat. Who wants to hang out in the strip commercial Anywhere USA corridor here? This happens to be Archer Road in Gainesville, Florida. My position is that we need a paradigm shift. We need to design our roads for attentiveness. We need attentive roads, not forgiving roads, for better safety. One of the things that Hans Monderman, the founder of that movement of attentive roads, recommends, unfortunately Hans recently died, one of his recommendations, and this has been implemented in a number of places in Europe, and resulting in a big drop in crashes in Europe, is that removing warning signs, removing street striping, removing traffic signals and stop signs actually reduces crashes, increases safety counterintuitively. Because now more of the responsibility is going towards the motorists and the other street users. Okay, less of a false sense of security, and people being more attentive when they use the streets. Because now they're more obligated to be attentive. They have more responsibility to be attentive. And of course, a very common tactic worldwide is that we use traffic calming. We design streets to obligate slower car speeds. This results in really dramatic reductions in crashes. Injuries and deaths go way down when you see the design of these very modest street widths. Part of that effort of traffic calming, of course, is road diets, where you actually remove travel lanes. You go, for example, most commonly in the U.S. today, you go from 4 lanes to 3 lanes, the third lane being a turn lane, or turn pockets. It's a very effective tool for traffic calming, for reducing car speeds. Fred Kent, the president of Project for Public Spaces, tells a story of a project he did in New Jersey 10 or 20 years ago, I can't remember, maybe 15 years ago, where he went to the New Jersey Department of Transportation engineers, and he said to them, I want you to design for me a street crossing that would be safe for a mother and child. so they would be able to safely cross the street. Okay? He was overwhelmed with a tidal wave of great ideas that we all love, these ideas that we know are effective, like creating landscape bulb outs, or other kinds of traffic calming, road diets, things that we know are very effective for slowing speed and reducing crashes. And the lesson learned from that project or that discussion or that request was that it's not so much that the engineers, the traffic engineers, don't understand how to design safer streets. Okay? They just need to be granted permission to recommend these other forms of design. Okay? They know typically how to design safe streets, how to design livable streets that are good for community quality of life, but they're not being given permission to make those recommendations. If their managers, if their elected officials are giving them permission to make these recommendations, they are much more likely to come back and say, yes, let's go ahead and do these progressive, effective things. They need to be given permission. And perhaps it goes back even further than that. The voters need to give elected officials permission to make the recommendations that they actually use these quality designs, these quality of life designs. So permission is a really, really important granting that you need to provide to your traffic engineers. Clearly, throughout the U.S., we've created these really hostile, car-only, commercial anywhere USA corridors. Every city has them. I'm sure you see some of this in Fort Collins. Everyone sees the pedestrian here, the forgotten pedestrian. Really an awful situation for him, really dangerous situation. These are obviously incomplete streets. They're only designed for cars. Okay? We need to move the paradigm again towards more complete streets. One of the great things about complete streets is a concept that's a recently coined term, is that complete streets are, of course, self-defining. It's pretty easy to know what a complete street is. It's a street that's designed for not just cars, but for buses, for pedestrians, for bicyclists. And also, too, another powerful reason that this term resonates is that who can possibly be opposed to complete streets? Or who could possibly be supportive of incomplete streets? It's really hard for you to say you don't want complete streets. Okay, and a lot of communities are actually around the country. I'm a complete streets instructor nationally. Around the country, we're seeing a lot of cities and counties and states establish complete streets policies that actually makes complete streets the default design. Okay, they must do the special studies to say why the complete streets are not going to be installed, instead of what the reverse is for most of America, which is we default towards the incomplete streets, and you must do special studies to justify the completeness. Okay, these newly emerging cities, states, and counties are saying, let's make this the default. Complete streets, special studies to justify not doing complete streets. Okay, so some examples of the comparison between 4 lanes and 3. Very common to see 4 lanes in cities. Very, very common, increasingly common to see road dieting to 3 lanes. Okay, very common. Which carries more traffic? Surprisingly, they carry about the same amount of traffic. Below 25,000 car trips per day, they carry about the same amount of traffic. That's largely because the inner lane in a 4-lane commonly serves as a left turn lane. When a person is making a left turn in a 4-laner, this essentially becomes a 3-lane street. So you really lose very little, if any, capacity when you go from 4 lanes to 3. Traffic engineers are increasingly recognizing that, and we're seeing this conversion from 4 to 3 all over the country now, because it's resulting in overnight benefits for quality of life, reduced crashes, retail health. Clearly, the 4-laner is going to give you much more speeding. We see that from a lot of studies. Clearly, the 4-lane as well results in more crashes. And as I said, the 3-lane, going from 4 lanes to 3, the studies are showing that dramatic, almost overnight improvements in retail along these road-dieted streets. Obviously better for bikes and pedestrians to go from 4 to 3 lanes. It's becoming increasingly a no-brainer to go from 4 to 3. Many communities are actually starting to go from 5 to 3, And they're starting to reduce the number of lanes when they have 6-laners as well. So it's a growing movement, perhaps a tipping point we're reaching with road diets around the country. One of the points that Dan Burden makes, I don't know if he made this point last Wednesday, is that we're actually seeing this reversal, this 180-degree turn in terms of our approach to designing our community. The past 50 years we were doing these things. Okay? Over the next 50 years, we're essentially going to be doing the opposite in all categories. Okay? So it's a 180-degree shift, perhaps a tipping point. Okay? Moving away from the old, increasingly unsustainable pattern, a pattern that's really not at all helpful for our quality of life, in fact, very detrimental to our quality of life, moving towards the opposite in many cases. And as I said, we're seeing an emerging paradigm shift towards attentive street design around the world. An example of a transformation. Designing for more attentiveness. All of these things, of course, are resulting in big increases in quality of life. Some of these are hypothetical, of course, but typically we see that these efforts to take back space from cars, which almost always is beneficial to quality of life, and for retail health, almost always we see dramatic overnight improvements for quality of life, for safety, and for retail health. So we can see transformations like this to move towards more traditional transportation choice-rich design. Okay? Adding street trees allows for more enclosure. People like to feel more enclosed. They don't like the wide open, exposed kind of ambience that strip commercial provides. Another option is to establish a roundabout system where you actually remove traffic signals and instead install roundabouts. Roundabouts do admittedly have some learning curve, but we know from studies that there's a dramatic reduction in crashes and injuries and deaths when you install roundabouts instead of traffic signals. And again, adding street trees is very effective for enclosure and for the quality of the ambiance. Now, things to be careful about in public meetings. What I call the moral high ground, okay? These kinds of tactics will often be recommended, and we will see that there will be squelchers who will attempt in public meetings to squelch these initiatives, okay? They will often say, you know what, if you do a road diet, we're going to have a bunch of increased air pollution because there's going to be a lot more stop and go and slow traffic, and it's going to be bad for our quality of our air. We're also going to see gridlock, okay? Road diet's going to cause gridlock. In fact, what we find from studies is that not only do we not see an increase in air pollution, we see on a regional basis the decline in air pollution. Air emissions from cars goes down on a regional basis when you do road diets and you make the streets more human, less car-oriented. And of course, the classic squelcher from the fire department in many cities is that if you do these attentive streets, if you do these road diets, more babies will die in burning buildings. Very common argument, very, very hard for elected officials to stand up to that and say, you know what, we support more babies dying in burning buildings because we want a better quality of life. It's very difficult to argue that. So these moral high ground arguments are very common, and people must be very careful about them and be on guard for them. And of course, one of our difficulties with some of these moral high ground arguments is that there's almost a unanimous consensus that those things are true. And so what's happened? We have a consensus that widening roads reduces congestion, right? Widening roads reduces congestion. Everyone believes that pretty much for the past several decades. And look at the great foolishness, the bankrupting of our cities, states, and federal government with the widenings we've done, which have resulted, in fact, in very quickly in the same level, if not worse levels of congestion after we did the widening. The foolishness of doing that, the foolishness of destroying our quality of life, destroying any chance of having transportation choices with widening roads. The foolishness of the consensus is very common in a lot of communities. One of the great things about traffic calming is that it will reduce the peaks. Okay, you have much less in the way of stop and start traffic, stop and go traffic. Calming will moderate those peaks. Okay, the car traffic becomes less stop and go, it becomes smoother and safer, more humanized when you use traffic calming tactics like road diets or landscape bulb outs, for example. The SWIFT study from 2003 in Longmont, Colorado, clear positive correlation between width of roads and safety. Okay, injury crash rate goes up dramatically when you see street width increase. So again, needing to move towards more attentive street design, moving away from forgiving street design is very important. And it takes some real leadership on the part of elected officials, because there still remains the anachronism of most traffic engineers being schooled to design the forgiving streets. One of the important tools that is emerging today in urban design is the transect concept, the concept that says that one size does not fit all. Okay, we don't design the entire community for a suburban lifestyle or suburban form of travel, for example. We have different lifestyles. We should provide for all of them by having context-sensitive regulations, context-sensitive street design. Our town centers need to be much more designed for pedestrians, needing to be more compact and formal, okay, more mixed use. As you move away from the town center, things become lower density, less formal, less mixed use. You tend to have higher car speeds. All of this transformation means that the community needs to move away from what's typical for almost all communities, and that is this one-size-fits-all land development regulation code. You move towards a code that's calibrated for each of your zones, each of your lifestyle zones in your community, so they all get their special treatment that maximizes that lifestyle you're trying to achieve in each of these zones, these transect zones. So for example, in the town center, the pedestrian is the design imperative. Everything comes after the pedestrian in your design. Everything. The pedestrian needs to have its quality maximized first, then everything else is provided for. Pedestrians come first. In the inner suburb, the bicycle and the bus are the paradigm for design. Now you have larger spaces somewhat than your town center. Your design needs to be primarily focused on the bike and the bus for your design. The outer suburb, of course, becomes more dispersed and high speed. That's much more conducive to car travel. So the car tends to be more of the design imperative in the outer suburbs. And then in your rural and preservation areas, of course, you have another set of regulations that apply there. You have much bigger spaces, much more dispersal, much less urban design, much more protection. So, in my many years of being a bicycle commuter and a recreational bicyclist and being a professional and doing my master's thesis in bicycle transportation, I did a huge amount of reading, and I got a tremendous amount of awareness of what works and doesn't work in terms of inducing more people to become bicyclists. I would think that most all of us who want to see advocacy for bicycling or improved bicycling conditions ultimately want to see the growth in the number of people that are bicycling on a regular basis. Okay? So what are those really effective tactics? And this list I'm going to show you is roughly an order of effectiveness, the first ones being the most effective, the ones at the bottom being lesser of effectiveness. The most effective, in my view, for promoting bicycling, more bicycling and walking, is to make your parking for cars much more efficient and priced. Donald Shoup, in The High Cost of Free Parking, makes some very important points about how most cities provide very, very inefficient parking, excessive amounts of free parking especially, which makes it very irrational and very unlikely for people to do anything other than drive a car. In fact, Donald Shoup makes the point that requiring abundant free parking, as almost every city does, every city and county does, is essentially a fertility drug for cars. Doing that kind of parking, providing that kind of parking really inevitably creates a tremendous amount of car dependence. Another effective tactic, as I mentioned earlier, is proximity. If you can shrink distances between things, you make it much more likely that people will walk or bicycle. because long distances are almost impossible to overcome with any incentives. You must have short distances to make it possible for large numbers of people to walk or bicycle. And there are ways you do that. The mixed use and the density increases are two of the best ways, but there are many ways that we can move towards more proximity. Higher gas prices, of course, very, very few, if any of us, want to see higher gas prices, but it's really a bitter medicine that we have to realize that the higher the gas prices are, the more likely it is we're going to see people, from the point of view of rationality, financial rationality, to bicycle or walk or use transit. One of the things about gas taxes is that that's one of the few ways that local governments have to actually deliberately affect that price signal of gas cost. We have very little, obviously we have pretty much no control over what happens to oil resources in the Middle East that we import or whatever. We do have some local control over the rate of the amount of our gas tax. And so we actually have some control over price signals for gas through our gas tax mechanisms. Very effective that we have smaller block lengths and connected streets. Many cities now either strongly discourage or prohibit cul-de-sacs and dead ends because they're very, very inconvenient for bicyclists and pedestrians. They discourage that form of travel. And there are a number of other reasons as well why connected streets are much better for the community's quality of life and financial health that we have these kinds of streets. And again, as I said earlier, slowing speeds is almost is perhaps one of the most powerful things I can recommend that we do to improve quality of life and improve safety. If we can reduce overall car speeds, we've really achieved tremendous objectives for inducing bicycling and walking especially. Another very powerful tool that we're starting to see increasingly around the country is the conversion of one-way streets to two-way streets. Very effective tool for improving retail health, inducing bicycling and walking, because one-way streets are very difficult for many bicycle commuters especially. They tend to result in wrong-way bicycling and inconvenience, having to go make roundabout route trips to your destination if you have one-ways. And so it's very difficult for people that are not motorized to contend with a lot of one-way streets. A lot of cities are now seeing huge benefits to converting from one-way to two-way around the country, and so it's becoming increasingly common to correct what in many cases was a mistake of going originally to a one-way street. And actually do a full presentation on the conversion of one-ways to two-ways because I think it's a very important, needed tactic. Part of the attentiveness idea and reducing of the speeds of cars is that streets, intersections need to either be kept small or made small again by dieting them, taking away space from cars if they're already too big. And again, we're seeing this around the country increasingly. We're seeing spaces on street dimensions being shrunk to get more human-scaled spacing, human-scale dimensioning for streets. Another powerful tactic, I don't know what's going on here in Fork City, Fort Collins, but it's so important to have a full-time staff who are assigned to bicycle and pedestrian travel, okay? Very, very commonly you don't see a full-time staff member assigned to bicycling and pedestrian advocacy or design on your local government staff. And that tends to be a real problem because, of course, that the engineering department, the public works department staff tends to be overloaded with a number of different issues they have to address. And if bicycle needs are just one small part of what's part of your job description, it tends to be very easily brushed aside or given a lower priority. And of course, the obvious corrective to that is to have full-time staff in your local government. It's really important that you create this herd mentality. Okay, you need to create this whole perception that, you know, so many other people are doing it. My neighbors, my friends are doing this. I want to do it too. It becomes this herd thing that you want to be part of the action. You want to be part of what everyone else is doing. You feel more comfortable and safe if other people are doing it. If you're part of the herd, it seems more hip, more normal to bicycle. Now, you'll notice, perhaps some of you have noticed, that this last item, this last bullet here, I didn't mention those above. Okay? I personally don't believe that these last items, bike lanes, sidewalks, showers, bike parking, very commonly recommended to increase bicycling, I don't believe that any of these are significantly inducing new bicyclists. Okay? I do, however, believe these are important things to do. I don't want to suggest that we should not be doing these things. I strongly advocate doing these things, largely because they send a visible message that this city is friendly to bicycling. Okay? We provide these things. We're visually making a statement that we want to see more bicycling, and that's a very important thing to do. Even if it doesn't necessarily increase dramatically the number of people you have bicycling, and I don't believe they necessarily do. Okay? Related to that topic, you know, the bike parking, the bike lanes, commonly that's really about all we can really do. A lot of those other tactics I showed you on that list previously, we really have very little, if any, control over doing those things. They're very effective. We don't tend to recommend them, largely because we have really not much control over those things. And so what happens is that if all of our problems look like nails, how does that go again? If all we have is a hammer, all our problems look like nails, right? And all we have is the hammer of bike lanes and bike parking and showers. If that's about the only thing we have under our control, then typically it seems like all of our problems are nails, and they can only be solved with the hammer. And we tend to forget some of the really effective tactics, largely because they're out of our control. So we have to remember effectiveness and not just push those things that we want to push because those happen to be under our control. We have to realize effectiveness is a really important thing to keep in mind. And so let me go through these kinds of tactics more visually. Again, Donald Shoup is a person I highly recommend reading his recent book, The High Cost of Reparking. Perhaps the best book I ever read about city planning in my career. He talks about how essential it is that you provide less excessive parking. The parking has to be more modestly provided, more subordinate to your human habitat, and it needs to be priced properly. It needs to be priced so that you don't have inefficient use of parking. Almost always, when you have a scenario where you have free parking, you have parking shortages. And economists all know that shortages are corrected most effectively by pricing that shortage. You reduce low-value parking, for example, by pricing properly your parking. Of course, very difficult politically, admittedly, but a very important tactic to move towards. And in fact, a lot of cities around the country are actually doing this now. They're actually providing more efficient priced parking, and they're seeing tremendous benefits from doing that. One of the very important tactics for making parking more efficient is in your residential development program. Okay? Almost always we provide parking as a part of the price of the housing. It's bundled together. Okay? Almost always when you buy a residence, the cost includes the parking. Some of us would like to have the option of saying, you know what, I don't want to have to pay for the parking because I'm not going to use the parking. I tend to get around by bicycling or walking or using the bus. So I don't want to pay extra for my housing for parking space I'm not going to use. And of course, if they have that option of having unbundled parking from the residential purchase, they can buy more housing. The housing becomes more affordable if they're not forced to pay for the parking. So Donald Shoup makes a very important point that you unbundle, when you can, the price of the parking from the price of the residence. Very important that you have, obviously, higher densities and mixed uses in your town centers especially. That really effectively reduces your travel distances. It really promotes proximity. Gas taxes, we need to see price signals reflect the fact that we need to move towards more sustainable forms of travel. Some of us are saying that we are reaching, if we haven't reached already, peak oil, and we need to wean ourselves off from excessive dependence on gasoline consumption and car travel. short blocks and connected streets. The very typical pattern of disconnected cul-de-sacs in suburbs, much more efficient, much more likely to provide a higher level of bicycling and walking when you have connected streets and shorter block lengths. You're much more likely to have direct short routes to your destinations versus the more conventional method where the distances are much longer because you have so much disconnection. Okay? Again, lower speeds, very, very important. Reducing speed differential between cars, pedestrians, and bicyclists is essential for inducing more travel by those forms. Converting one-ways to two-ways, as I said earlier, growing, very commonly used tactic, very common around the country today because of the very, very obvious benefits that cities see almost overnight when they convert the one-ways to two-ways. Making intersections and streets more modest in width, okay? This kind of thing, we're seeing a movement towards this kind of thing. Increasing safety and inducing much higher levels of bicycling and walking, okay? More human scale, safer, slower speeds, better retail environment, better residential quality, okay? This is all about the car. This is all about inducing suburban sprawl. This is all about pretty much requiring all trips to be made by car because these are the only trips you really can conceivably make. Economists call this the barrier effect. When you design these street-only designs, these big high-speed designs, you create barriers for other forms of travel. Okay? It's a zero-sum game. The more you design for happy cars, the less you're going to see bicycling, walking, and transit use. You create barriers. Again, overworked public works staff. If you don't have full-time staff dedicated to only bicycling design, bicycling advocacy, usually pedestrian as well, you tend to have overloaded staff who are not able to prioritize bicycle and pedestrian design as they need to. They tend to be overworked, and it's just not really realistic to expect your staff to just take that on as one of their many, many duties. It must be a full-time task by your staff. There are many cities around the country that have leftover or neglected, wasted spaces that can be transformed to something much better for the quality of your retail, quality of your life, quality of safety in your city. You see these conversions increasingly, okay? Converting these leftover, neglected dump spaces to something that's a real amenity for your community. You turn your back towards your amenities instead of turning your back to these neglected wastelands, okay? And of course, these separated bike path systems are wonderful places for training people who are not comfortable bicycling. These tend to be training grounds for the new bicyclist. And so they actually work very well in inducing people to become bicyclists or try out bicycling in a safe environment, much more likely to grow new bicyclists in that sense than to provide the in-street bike lanes. So these tend to be good training grounds for people that are more uneasy or timid about bicycling in traffic. They work very well in doing that and providing that kind of training ground. So if we can find ways to effectively create more bicyclists, we can establish a virtuous cycle, not a vicious cycle, but a virtuous cycle, where actually the growth in bicyclists results in safety in numbers, which I believe is a very, very powerful way to increase safety for bicyclists and pedestrians. If you have large numbers of them traveling in your community, motorists increasingly expect to see them and learn how to drive near them safely. Safety in numbers is a very powerful tactic and a very virtuous cycle tactic of growing more bicyclists and pedestrians in this kind of a cycle. The safety in numbers is a very powerful tool. One thing I did, I was recently living in Richmond, Virginia, And one thing you can do in your community is you can look down the list of effective tactics for inducing bicycling and walking, and you could say to yourself, well, how do we score out? How do we grade ourselves as a community for promoting bicycling and walking? And as you can see, the scoreboard for Richmond, Virginia was pretty poor. Okay? There are ways you can actually score yourself to decide how well you're doing and perhaps make visible to your larger community how well you're doing and how much better you can improve in certain categories. The grades, the scorecards, those kinds of things are kind of accessible to people. People pretty readily understand that concept from school children and school days. So, a lot of this is perception, okay? It's very important in my view to normalize bicycling, make it seem normal, okay? Make it seem like something that people normally do, make it seem like something that a lot of people in the community do. In Europe, you see a lot of normal looking people wearing normal clothing, okay? Very normal, okay? So which of these seems more normal? I think that goes without saying. And more controversially, which of these images promotes what a colleague of mine calls the dangerization of bicycling? Okay? Actually, my life was saved in Boulder in the mid-90s when I had a really serious bicycle crash. A bike helmet saved my life. I don't recommend that we request that bicyclists not wear helmets, but I do believe that it perhaps is a good tactic for us to consider that if we don't obsessively request that all bicyclists wear helmets, we can perhaps ratchet down the dangerization of bicycling. One of the most common reasons people will give for why they don't bicycle is that they will tell you that it's too dangerous. And it could very well be that wearing a bicycle helmet, as important as that is for many of us, it could be that if we obsessively call for that, we will undermine our efforts to promote more bicycling because we're dangerizing the activity by visually showing that it's unsafe to ride a bicycle perhaps. And so it's something to think about. Somewhat controversial as a concept, but the dangerization I think is a really important concern that we have to think about. Safety numbers, huge numbers of people bicycling in Europe. They're in a virtuous cycle where it seems really normal and safe. So safe that some of them are actually text messaging as they're riding their bicycle. Okay? Very normal, safe perception when you have the situation they have in Europe. A recent journal article, in a study, they found that safety in numbers is in fact something that we see from our studies in cities that have large numbers of bicyclists. We're seeing the effect of safety improvements when you see larger numbers of bicyclists. This is an important concept. What we're seeing here is obviously a really crowded, congested kind of a scene for motorists and pedestrians and bicyclists bypassing the congestion. A very important tactic, one that we often miss, one that we often get wrong. I often hear bicycle and pedestrian advocates recommend the improvements for bicyclists and pedestrians, saying that if we provide for bicyclists and pedestrians, we will reduce traffic congestion. I hear that all the time. I believe that's a tactically undesirable method. It's not a good idea to suggest in public meetings that will reduce traffic congestion by improving conditions for bikes and pedestrians. Okay, and that's largely because cars take up so much space, on average 19 times more space. A person sitting in a car takes up 19 times more space than a person sitting in a chair. That's a lot of consumption of space. It means that only a small number of people are needed in cars to congest the road. It's really almost impossible for us to reduce congestion visually. Okay? It's not that we're going to see a reduction in congestion if we do well with bikes and pedestrians. What we're going to see, what we want to promote, is alternatives. We want to allow people to escape congestion if they find that they just can't tolerate the congestion. They want to find ways around it. So we have to provide the alternatives to the congestion. Not to suggest congestion is going to go down, because it probably won't. In a healthy community, it's almost impossible to see the congestion go down, even if you do really well in growing the number of bicyclists and pedestrians. You need to provide alternatives for where people live and how they travel. That's the key for progressive design in your communities, to provide alternatives to congestion so that people can escape it if they want to. And that concludes my presentation. I will be happy to accept any comments or questions. Thank you.
The penalty is the same whether you're breaking the law with a bicycle as it is with and hitting a car as it would be if you're in a car and hitting a bicycle.
Right. There's obviously different levels of consequences for motorist crashes versus bicycle.
Bigger penalties.
Yeah. Yeah.
That needs to be undone.
Right. Clearly, there are many situations where a motorist will, through inattentiveness especially, will hurt severely or kill someone and be given a slap on the wrist. And that is a real, I think, a real legal problem we have. There's real inequities, there's real unfairness when we don't see consequences clearly attached to the grievous actions that we've seen occur, the really awful ruination of lives, destruction of lives, get slapped in the wrists as a consequence. I don't personally know how well we can be in changing a lot of behavior, though, with taking that approach. I mean, I guess it's a question of whether you feel there will be a deterrent effect if the consequences are high enough, that people will see that, you know, there are major legal consequences if I engage in dangerous driving.
The classic case is Mothers Against Drunk Drivers. That had a huge effect.
Yes, Mothers Against Drunk Drivers has had an effect, I believe, on motorist behavior. We see a lot.
It became such a stigma to get a drunk driving ticket. And so if it became a stigma to get a ticket for hitting a cyclist who was law-abiding, then people would start to pay attention.
So so what you're saying is instituting higher repercussions for accidents against pedestrians and bicyclists. All right, let's move to the next question.
This is an easy question, DK. Are there any transportation planners in the room?
We do have an urban planner in the room for the city of Fort Collins. Next question? Yes, right over here. Dave.
DK?
Yeah, I really like the idea of reducing,
We'll get back to you.
the big 4 lanes to 3 lanes. And do you have a good idea in Fort Collins, and could you recommend, reducing, one of our 4-lane highways like Prospect or Drake down to more human scale kind of environment?
Sure.
I'll get that back to him real quick. Did you capture that one?
I frankly haven't really traveled much in Fort Collins. I don't really know what the situation is for your streets. I did see a couple of the streets today, and I guess one of your problems, I'm guessing, is that some of your streets that are perhaps rather obviously in need of a road diet are perhaps state roads, and I'm thinking about College Avenue, I think, as one example. State roads tend to be an enormous battle, even if it's a clear case of a need for a road diet. And I think that College looks like one where I would want to see space removed from cars, because there's a huge amount of space provided to cars in College, and some of your other downtown streets that you have a pressing need for compact proximity and walkability and lower speeds. You've got these enormously wide streets in Fort Collins in your town center, which are really incompatible with a town center for walkability and slow speeds. And so to me, it seems like there's a real big opportunity for a lot of road diets in Fort Collins. In my personal opinion, 4-lane streets have no business in a town center. They just don't belong. And almost all of them need to go from 4 lanes to 3, in my view.
Very good. David? Here we go, David. Jesus.
current example of that here in town is Laurel Street on the north side. There's strictly a road diet issue and a safety issue for CSU students.
Absolutely. Good point.
Follow-up question on that?
Yeah, absolutely, Rick.
So to follow up on that, we have two critical areas in town that are purportedly supposed to be pedestrian friendly: Old Town and CSU campus. Up until last year, we had 4 major roads surrounding campus that were 4 lane. They put Laurel on a road diet. We still have 3 roads. One is a state highway, College Avenue, but the others are designed seems to move people in and out of that university by automobile quickly. What happens after you get to 25,000 vehicles a day? Because I think some of those roads may move more than that. Does the system crash? Or should we be reducing speeds and putting at least 2 of those other streets on road diets with the understanding that the long-term master plan for CSU is a pedestrian campus?
Okay. That's that.
I don't necessarily agree with the position that we should not ever consider road diets for streets that carry more than 25,000 trips per day. That's a rule of thumb, and I'm not sure if I really clearly understand what the consequences would be for road dieting a street with 25,000 car trips or more. It's possible that some people are concerned that above 25,000 car trips, road diets where you go from, say, 4 lanes to 3, you'll see too much spillover parking to adjacent streets, which can be really unpleasant for those adjacent streets. And did I say spillover parking? Spillover traffic to the adjacent streets. So that, I believe that's a concern. I don't personally have that big of a concern for considering road diets for larger volumes. I believe that we can maybe find out what happens in an incremental way without the world ending. There's other things that I perhaps missed that you mentioned that.
I have a few quick comments on you're talking about around the CSU campus. I went to undergrad at Arizona State University, which is strictly a pedestrian campus, surrounded by 4 major streets and has a light rail running through campus also. I think they do a very good job of, eliminating accidents in that area. I think because as soon as you cross one of those major streets that surround the campus, you are in a neighborhood, and I think CSU does a fairly good job. You go south, you can take the Mason Trail. You go north, you can take Loomis. You go east, you can take Elizabeth, or going west, you can take Elizabeth. Now, going to the east is a little bit difficult, like you said, on Prospect, but you have pretty good options there. I would love to see them shut down campus to cars, though, and make it a strictly pedestrian campus, as they did at Arizona State. All the parking was way far off by the stadium at Arizona State, and everybody either walked in or took your longboard or your bike or whatever, and that was it. I thought it was a great idea, and CSU's getting to the size of where Arizona State was. Arizona State, I think, top 5 in size in student body. So we're getting there at CSU.
Good. Do you want to comment on that?
Let me say
Okay,
something.
very good.
Despite my comments earlier, I'm not really a militant anti-car person. I don't believe, despite what many people both think or say, I don't think that we should get rid of all cars. People often accuse me of that. And so for commonly, I actually don't necessarily advocate that we create car-free zones. We failed that in that effort many times around the country. We created these pedestrian-only streets. And in most cases, they actually did not succeed. Boulder is one of the few in the country that did succeed. But in my view, almost always, it's not so much eliminating cars as designing your streets to obligate well-behaved car travel. That slow-speed, attentive car travel is actually quite conducive to a quality human habitat, and in many cases can be as desirable and as beneficial as total removal of cars. I do acknowledge, though, that in some cases you can see benefits, wonderful benefits from car-free zones, but you have to be very careful that you don't actually create a really undesirable situation in certain ways, in certain places like retail corridors where you create dead zones with a total elimination of cars. where you could see improvement just simply by obligating cars to drive better and slower and more attentively. When you say changes, you mean the road diet change, for example?
Either that or the more, urban or denser downtown or like pedestrian. Do you know or are you aware of any conversion rates of people from driving their cars to being more, biking more, walking more, and is it geared only for the young?
Frankly, I can't cite for you examples that's happened around the country. I'm confident that it has happened in a number of cases, and I'm confident there are studies that show that change, but I can't cite the studies. I personally would just do a Google search to find examples, and I don't know if we necessarily will only see that benefiting younger people necessarily. I think that sometimes in your design, if you actually design to make conditions better for children, for example, you are having a multiplier effect. That even if your objective was to provide better conditions for children, it benefits adults, it particularly benefits senior citizens. There are other groups that benefit naturally from the provision. Even if you're providing for just one group or one age category, you can see those spillover benefits to other categories.
There was a question, a member of the audience wanted to know how our Mason Corridor, our bus rapid transit system, which runs north-south, or will in the next couple of years here, plays a part in the overall traffic network, right? Good.
I don't know specifics of the bus rapid transit system for Collins. I can say that in other cities that have used the bus rapid transit, it has been sometimes noticeable in terms of number of increased riders, transit riders. It can really benefit transit ridership because of increased frequency, and so in fact many cities will use bus rapid transit as a lower cost option to something like light rail. Light rail and bus rapid transit often provide similar levels of service, and many cities find that they can get almost the same benefits from bus rapid transit as light rail. So I can expect there to be some positive benefits from bus rapid transit. But again, as I tried to apply earlier, there's no real silver bullets on some of this stuff, like growing the number of transit users, for example, through a silver bullet of bus rapid transit or even light rail. There are a number of things that have to be in place typically for you to see big growth in transit ridership. Things like controlling your parking, making your parking more efficient, having higher densities in your transit corridors. Those things need to work concurrently with your increased transit quality. There is no silver bullet, and unfortunately, we took so many decades to get where we are today. There really are no real overnight solutions. A lot of what I was talking about are things that we're going to have to do. We're going to have to work on incrementally over the long term, and hopefully we'll have the persistence and wisdom to pursue those things for the long term, because they're largely not overnighters that we can expect to find.
Very good. The question in the back over here. Okay. Good.
Just real quick, on the topic of back-end diagonal parking, any comments, positive, negative?
Comments on back-end diagonal parking?
That's a good comment, good question. I am personally an advocate of back-end diagonal parking. I like the idea. I think that they're great for traffic calming. They're very useful for allowing people to enter the travel lane as a motorist safer, because they're driving straight out instead of backing in. I think that some of the concerns that I've heard, like the difficulty of backing in and the slowing down of car travel as a result of the slower speed of backing in. That again, to me, is contributing to needed traffic calming, but also there's just the learning curve process where people over time get used to doing that more often, and they feel safer. They feel like it's possible to do this without the world coming to an end. And I think there are a number of examples around the country where back-in diagonal parking has been shown to be a really beneficial tool. I think I really like the idea, actually.
Okay, any more last pressing questions for Dom? Okay, let's give Dom another round of applause. And thank you very much, Dom Nazi, for coming to Fort Collins and speaking about urban transportation. We appreciate it.
Thank you.
All right, on behalf of Fort Collins, City of Fort Collins, the FC Bike Program, thank you all for coming out to the Rio Bike Nights.